Have you ever imagined what a quiet morning by the sea looks like, when the mist still lies gently over the water, and suddenly, from the distance, the rhythmic beating of oars is heard like the heartbeat of the ocean? Out of the haze glide long ships with curved dragon heads at the bow, silent, but full of determination. On their decks stand men with a steady gaze and round shields, reflecting the light of the rising sun. Who are they? Feared pirates of Europe, experienced merchants marked by wind and waves, or explorers who set foot on American soil nearly 500 years before Columbus? They are the Vikings, a symbol that sparked both terror and fascination in the early Middle Ages. Over 3 centuries, from the late 8th to the 11th century, these people from the High North wrote one of the most turbulent chapters in European history. From lightning, fast raids and daring voyages across the world's oceans to the founding of dominions that shaped the continent's political and cultural map. Yet the history of the Vikings is far more than the clashing of swords on shields or the parting of waves by oars. It is the story of a resilient culture, a remarkably organized society, and a legacy that endures to this day. And like every great journey, it began with seemingly simple reasons: the search for new land, the escape from poverty, and sometimes simply the longing to explore the unknown. On our journey today, we will board legendary ships, cross the icy seas of the north, head for remote islands, and immerse ourselves in villages and cities shaped by the footsteps of the Vikings. We will meet kings, conquerors, and women who equally left their mark on the Nordic sagas, and by the end of this narrative, you will realize that the Vikings are not just an image of violence and war, but also an example of courage, wisdom, and an extraordinary ability to adapt. Join me on this journey now. When we consider the beginning of the Viking Age, we stand at a turning point in European history where the world of the Northmen transformed from a largely isolated, agricultural society into a maritime power whose influence reached far beyond the coasts of Scandinavia. Traditional dating sets the beginning around the year 793, when the raid on the monastery of Lindisfarne shook the Anglo-Saxon world. However, the roots of this development reach deeper into a time when economic pressures, social structures, climatic changes, and cultural dynamics formed a unique interplay. In the late 8th century, Scandinavia consisted of a multitude of small kingdoms and tribal territories where powerful family clans competed for land, influence, and honor. The landscape was characterized by fjords, islands, forests, and barren soils which, while allowing for the cultivation of grain and livestock farming, were insufficient in many regions to feed a growing population. Inheritance laws, which usually awarded land ownership to the eldest son, often forced younger brothers to seek new paths in life, and these not infrequently led across the sea. Added to this was a climatic phase of milder temperatures, known today as the medieval warm period. Longer growing seasons allowed for better supplies, but they also facilitated shipping and opened up the possibility of traveling further and more frequently. At the same time, Europe experienced a period of political fragmentation following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. In England, several rival Anglo-Saxon kingdoms ruled. In the Frankish Empire, power was divided between local nobles and a still young empire, and many coastal areas lacked strong defense structures. Yet the reasons for the Northmen's departure cannot be found in economic or political factors alone. Their culture was deeply permeated by a concept of honor that highly valued bravery, a thirst for adventure and glory in battle. In the stories of the gods of Norse mythology, life was an eternal struggle, and those who fell in battle could hope to sit at Odin's table in Valhalla. This idea was combined with a craftsmanship in shipbuilding that was unparalleled. The light, fast longships, with which they could navigate up rivers or reach coasts lightning fast, were the result of centuries of maritime experience. Historians have put forward various hypotheses about the trigger of the Viking Age. Some emphasize the expansion of the Frankish Empire under Charlemagne and his efforts to forcibly convert the pagan Saxons to Christianity. The Northmen may have seen a threat in these developments that drove them to preventive attacks. Others point to the rising demand for silver and luxury goods, which they could obtain through raids or trade to consolidate their position in the domestic hierarchy. And still others see the real engine in social dynamics. For younger warriors without land of their own, the sea offered the chance for glory, wealth, and perhaps a dominion of their own. In this mixture of necessity, opportunity, and cultural imprinting, the truth likely lies in a combination of all these factors. What makes the Viking Age unique is that it did not merely consist of a series of random raids, but rapidly developed into a complex system of robbery, trade settlement, and cultural exchange. The first generations may have set out primarily to take booty, but soon permanent trade routes, political alliances, and entire settlement areas formed far from home. The myths surrounding the beginning of this epoch are often overlaid by later narratives in which monks and chroniclers portrayed the Northmen as godless barbarians. Archaeological finds, however, show a more nuanced picture. They were not just warriors, but also skilled merchants, craftsmen, and farmers who spread new techniques and goods over vast distances. While written sources mostly come from the pens of their enemies, runic inscriptions, grave finds, and settlement remains speak a language that testifies to both hardness and innovative power. Thus, the Viking Age begins not like a single clap of thunder, but rather like a storm brewing on the horizon, slow but unstoppable. It is the result of a special constellation of nature, society, and the spirit of the times that produced a generation of people from the fjords and coasts of the north, whose names still inspire awe and fascination centuries later. And from this very starting point, we will dive deeper into the world of the Northmen themselves, their society, their culture, and their faith, which gave them the courage to venture into unknown waters. To truly understand the Northmen, it is not enough to simply look at their ships and their raids. One must step into their villages, hear the sound of smithing hammers, feel the smell of freshly baked bread and salted fish in the air, and experience the rhythm of the year determined by the changing seasons, the sea, and old customs. Viking society was clearly structured, yet it possessed a flexibility that was unusual for that time. At the top stood the jarls, powerful chieftains or princes who owned land, wealth, and followers. Beneath them lived the carls, free farmers, craftsmen, and traders who formed the backbone of the Nordic world. At the very bottom stood the thralls, slaves, often prisoners of war, who performed heavy labor but could in some cases earn their freedom, an indication that upward mobility was possible even in this strict hierarchy. It is striking that women in the Viking Age possessed more rights than in many other contemporary cultures of Europe. They could inherit land, conduct trade, and manage the farm in the absence of their husbands. A wealthy Viking woman was often the mistress of a large estate and wore a bunch of keys visibly on her belt, a symbol of her authority. In the sagas, too, we encounter strong female figures, wise counselors, courageous defenders, and sometimes even leaders of expeditions. This comparatively high status is partly explained by the practical necessity that in a society where many men were at sea for months, women had to make decisions independently. The social life of the Northmen was closely intertwined with their culture and their faith. In a world without a centralized written culture, knowledge was passed down through oral tradition. Skaldic poets recited stories of heroic deeds, ancestors, and gods, and these tales were more than just entertainment. They conveyed values such as bravery, loyalty, and honor. Norse mythology, with its gods Odin, Thor, Frey, and many others, was omnipresent. It explained the course of nature, the change from day to night, fate in war, and the inevitable end times, Ragnar. Rituals and festivals marked the annual cycle, sacrificial ceremonies in honor of the gods, celebrations for the summer solstice, and memorial feasts for deceased ancestors. These customs strengthened the sense of community and reminded everyone that each individual was part of a larger cosmic context. The Vikings knew no strict separation between religion and everyday life. The divine was present in the fields, in the storm, in victory, as well as in defeat. This worldview was also expressed in material culture. Jewelry in the form of Thor's hammers, artfully decorated weapons, and ship prows with carved dragon heads were all not only decorative, but carried symbolic meanings. Runic inscriptions, often short and concise, served both as markers of ownership and as magical protective signs. Here it becomes clear how closely art, craft, and faith were connected. If one compares Nordic society with contemporary cultures, such as the Carolingian Franks or the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, it is noticeable that while they possessed no centralized state power, they had a high degree of self-organization in local communities. Decisions were made at the Thing, a people's assembly, a place where free men and, in rare cases, women could raise their voices. This early rudimentary element of participation shows that power did not rest solely on inheritance or violence, but also on the consent of the community. The world of the Northmen was thus a complex web of social bonds, cultural traditions, and spiritual convictions. It combined pragmatism with deep symbolism, everyday work with mythical storytelling, and personal honor with collective responsibility. Whoever lived in this society grew up with the certainty that their own life was part of a larger plan often preordained by the gods, and that courage, loyalty, and skill could secure not only survival but also a place in the memory of posterity. And exactly this combination of social structure, cultural creativity, and spiritual depth formed the breeding ground for the astonishing achievements the Northmen were capable of, not least in shipbuilding and the art of war. Whoever wants to understand why the Northmen became feared, but also admired masters of the seas, in just a few generations must know their ships, those slender, seemingly living constructions of oak wood that were made to defy wind, waves, and currents. The longship, the iconic symbol of the Vikings, was not simply a means of transport, but the heart of their culture, a tool for trade, exploration, and war all at once. With its long, narrow shape, shallow keel, and overlapping planks connected in the so-called clinker construction method, it could not only reach high speeds on the open sea, but also navigate shallow river courses and land on almost any coast, a decisive advantage over the cumbersome, deep draft ships of the Franks or Anglo-Saxons. The longships did not rely solely on sails. They possessed dozens of rowing positions that allowed them to maneuver independently of the wind. Thus, the Vikings could make rapid progress even in calm or adverse winds, sail up rivers, and even fight against currents. The smaller, more robust Norse ships served primarily for trade and supply and could transport heavy loads, including livestock, wood, or trade goods, over long distances. But a ship alone does not make a sailor. And here the navigational arts of the Vikings came into play. Without a compass but with a keen eye for natural signs, they oriented themselves by the position of the sun, the constellations, and the movements of waves and ocean currents. Archaeological finds such as the so-called sunstone suggest that they could determine the position of the sun even under cloudy skies using special crystals. On the coast, they looked out for bird migrations or certain cloud formations that indicated land in the distance. This deep understanding of wind, water, and cardinal directions was not the result of a single brilliant inventor, but of centuries of experience passed down from generation to generation. Their art of war was as flexible and precise as their navigation. The element of surprise was one of the Vikings' most effective weapons. Thanks to their ships, they could appear practically out of nowhere, raid a village or a monastery, take booty, and disappear again before an organized defense was possible. On land, they fought in tightly closed formations, often with a shield wall that offered protection and simultaneously served as a platform for counterattack. Their equipment was functional and robust: round wooden shields, spears, axes, and swords, partly artfully decorated but designed primarily for effectiveness in battle. Compared to the heavily armored Frankish knights, the Vikings relied on mobility and speed. Their warriors could march long distances thanks to lighter armor, and adjust flexibly to changing battle situations. Psychological warfare also played a role. The sudden appearance of dragon heads at the bow, the war cries, the clashing of weapons, all of this was intended to intimidate opponents even before the first blow fell. At the same time, the Vikings were not pure plunderers. The same ships that made them feared warriors also brought them, as merchants and diplomats, to distant lands. On the same routes where they once raided monasteries, they later transported goods such as furs, honey, iron, glass beads, or even silk from the Orient. This dual role as warriors and merchants made them a decisive link between the cultures of Northern Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Middle East. The Vikings' mastery of the sea was therefore far more than technical superiority. It was an expression of a way of life in which mobility, adaptability, and the will to take risks were inextricably linked. Their ships were like extended limbs of their communities. They carried not only warriors but also stories, traditions, and hopes across the sea. And so it is no coincidence that precisely this maritime strength was the starting point for the great expansions of the Vikings, both to the west to the British Isles, Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland, and to the east along the rivers deep into Russia and on to Byzantium. We will now turn our gaze to these first bold strikes, from Lindisfarne to Iona, and see how the world reacted to the appearance of the Northmen. It was a June day in the year 793, when the monks of the monastery of Lindisfarne on the northeast coast of England prepared for the morning service. The fog still hung heavy over the sea, and the cries of seabirds mingled with the quiet rushing of the waves. Nothing indicated that in a few moments an event would occur that would echo through the chronicles of the time as a shockwave through Christian Europe. Suddenly, elongated silhouettes appeared out of the gray of the horizon, ships whose dragon heads seemed to dance in the water. A few minutes later, warriors broke onto land, quick, determined, and with an efficiency that stifled any resistance in the bud. They plundered the monastery, took valuable items, and carried off prisoners. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle speaks of terrible omens, as if to embed the disaster in a divine order. The raid on Lindisfarne did not mark the very first contact between Scandinavia and the British Isles, but certainly the moment when the Anglo-Saxon world realized that a new, unpredictable power would haunt the coasts. Lindisfarne was not chosen by chance. The monastery lay on a small tidal island, easily accessible from the sea and yet close to important trade and transport routes. Like many religious sites of that time, it was rich in silver, gold, relics, and books, but poor in defense, an ideal place for a quick strike. Only 2 years later, in 795, the Scottish island of Iona suffered a similar fate. Here, too, Norse warriors raided the famous monastery that had once been founded by the missionary Columba. The brutality of these attacks shook not only the local communities, but also the notion of the time that holy places were safe from violence through divine protection. For the Vikings, however, monasteries were primarily easily plundered centers of wealth, whose location on the coast allowed for a quick escape. These first strikes revealed the strategic thinking of the Northmen. They chose targets that promised maximum gain with minimum risky, wealthy, poorly defended, and located directly on navigable waters. Their appearance was always surprising, their withdrawals just as fast, and exactly this combination made them so dangerous. Compared to the organized campaigns of the Frankish Empire or the Anglo-Saxons, these attacks often involved smaller, highly mobile units that could react flexibly to opportunities. Historically viewed, the terror that Lindisfarne and Iona caused was the result of the cultural gap between attackers and attacked. For the Christian monks, the Vikings were pagan destroyers of the divine order. For the Northmen, however, these monasteries were just another target in a world where wealth and honor were often taken from what one could conquer with one's own strength. These diametrical perspectives shaped the surviving sources. Many reports we know today come from the pens of those who suffered the attacks, and therefore reflect primarily the fear and indignation of the victims. Yet it would be a mistake to view these early strikes solely as an expression of blind destructive rage. They were also the beginning of a pattern that closely linked trade, diplomacy, and violence. Not infrequently, such raids were followed later by trade contacts or even settlements, a sign that the Vikings pursued long-term interests. Reactions to these raids varied. Some regions began to erect coastal fortifications or introduce armed patrols. Others sought compromise through tribute payments. In any case, Lindisfarne and Iona fundamentally changed the perception of the North in the minds of the people of Western Europe. From a distant, semi-mythical region full of merchants and fishermen, it had suddenly become a source of constant threat. For the Northmen themselves, these successes were both confirmation and incentive. They proved that their ships, their tactics, and their determination could reach even the most remote and seemingly secure places. And so it was only a matter of time before their voyages went further and their goals became larger. A path that would soon lead them not only to the coasts of England and Scotland, but out into the North Atlantic to Iceland, Greenland, and finally to Vinland. After the first raids like those in Lindisfarne and Iona had paved the way, the presence of the Northmen in the West changed fundamentally. Quick raids turned into permanent conquests, and fleeting encounters gave rise to entire settlement areas. The British Isles, in particular, were at the center of this development. From the middle of the 9th century, not just individual ship crews arrived on the coasts, but entire fleets, organized under leaders who proceeded strategically. The so-called Great Heathen Army landed in England, conquered Northumbria, East Anglia, and large parts of Mercia, and established the Danelaw, an area where Danish law, language, and culture became authoritative. For the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, this was a new kind of war. While earlier raids aimed primarily at booty, these invasions aimed at control and integration. The Danelaw brought a cultural exchange with it. Old Norse words flowed into Old English, trade routes connected Scandinavian and English markets, and even in place names, the legacy of the Vikings remained visible. Under Alfred the Great and his successors, the Anglo-Saxons succeeded in reconquering the territories piece by piece, but the influence of the Northmen could no longer be erased. Parallel to these undertakings, daring kinships began to sail out across the North Atlantic. Iceland was discovered by accident by Norwegian seafarers around 870, some fleeing political oppression, others in search of fertile land. Within a few decades, the island was settled by a mixture of Norwegians, Celtic slaves, and free farmers. The Icelanders developed a remarkably independent culture in which the Althing, one of the oldest parliaments in the world, emerged. Here, disputes were settled and laws negotiated, an indication that the Vikings were not just warriors but also political shapers. From Iceland, the Northmen ventured to Greenland around 985. Eric the Red, after a 3-year banishment from Iceland, sailed westward and founded 2 settlements on the southwest coast. The climate of that time, somewhat milder than today, allowed agriculture on a small scale, and for a few centuries the community flourished. Trade with Iceland and Norway kept the colonies alive. However, isolation, climatic deterioration, and possibly conflicts with the Inuit eventually led to their decline in the 15th century. But perhaps the boldest step westward led even further to Vinland, present-day Newfoundland in Canada. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, sailed from Greenland and reached the American mainland around 500 years before Columbus. The sagas report fertile land, wild grapes, and mild winters. Archaeological finds at El Anzocs Meadows confirm the existence of a Norse settlement, which presumably served as a base for further explorations. However, this colony was short-lived. Conflicts with the indigenous peoples living there, logistical difficulties, and the enormous distance likely led to a rapid abandonment of the enterprise. Compared to the expansions of the Franks or Byzantines, the western advance of the Vikings was unique. It led not only to the conquest of land, but opened up completely new spaces beyond the known world. While other powers secured their rule through land armies and fortified cities, the Northmen relied on maritime mobility, flexible structures, and the ability to adapt quickly to new environments. This expansion to the west changed not only the geography of settlements, but also the self-understanding of the Northmen. They were no longer just coastal raiders but explorers and colonizers asserting themselves in rough, unknown regions. The stories from Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland found their way into the sagas and shaped the collective memory of the Nordic world. But while new horizons were being conquered in the west, an equally exciting chapter opened in the east, along the rivers of Russia via trade routes to the Black and Caspian Seas. While their western expeditions led the Northmen as far as Greenland and Vinland, a completely different gate opened in the opposite direction, the east. A vast network of rivers, lakes, and trade routes reaching from the Baltic Sea deep into the heart of Eurasia. This route was no less bold than the voyages across the Atlantic, yet it differed in goal and character. Instead of stormy seas, travelers here faced endless water arteries, densely forested banks, strange peoples, and a variety of goods that came from distant, often mythical lands. Swedish Vikings, in particular, often referred to in sources as Varangians, made use of these routes. From trading centers like Birka and Gotland, they sailed across the Baltic Sea, headed for the coasts of Finland, and then followed the great rivers like the Neva, the Volga, or the Dnieper. These rivers were not just transport arteries, but lifelines connecting northern and eastern Europe with the Abbasid Caliphate, with Byzantium, and even with Central Asian markets. The Varangians used their light, robust boats to bypass rapids, or transport them on land routes between river courses, a logistical feat proving how adaptable and determined these seafarers were. Their path led them initially through the territories of Finno, Ugric, and Slavic tribes. Encounters were not always peaceful. Archaeological finds and chronicles report raids, forced tribute payments, and armed conflicts. Yet just as often, trade relations arose, from which permanent settlements eventually emerged. Cities like Novgorod and Kiev developed from such bases and became centers of a rising power structure that would later become known as Kievan Rus. The primary chronicle, one of the most important medieval sources of Eastern Europe, tells how Slavic tribes invited the Varangians to rule over them, to bring order to their fragmented territories. The legendary Prince Rurik is said to have accepted this invitation, and his descendants expanded rule over a huge area reaching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. This core legend is historically not undisputed, but it clarifies the role of the Vikings not only as warriors but also as rulers and integrators. Trade was the real engine of this eastern expansion. Via the Volga, goods such as furs, honey, wax, and slaves reached the markets of the Caliphate, while silver coins from Samarra, Baghdad, or Nishapur found their way north. On the Dnieper, on the other hand, the path led south to the mighty gates of Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. Here, at the intersection between Europe and Asia, the Varangians met a culture that appeared to them alien and at the same time fascinating in splendor, organization, and religion. Relations between the Varangians and Byzantium were changeable. There were military confrontations, such as during sieges of Constantinople in the 9th century, but soon after, a phase of intensive cooperation followed. Byzantium recruited the strong, battle-hardened Northmen for its famous Varangian Guard, an elite unit that served the emperor personally. These bodyguards, recognizable by their heavy axes, enjoyed high prestige and were considered incorruptible since they had no family ties in the empire. Compared to the Western undertakings of the Vikings, which were often characterized by rapid raids and land seizures, the Eastern expeditions possessed a stronger economic and diplomatic dimension. The Northmen in the East connected the Northern Sea with the markets of the Mediterranean and the Orient, and they did this not solely through violence, but also through networks, alliances, and the skillful use of political opportunities. Yet this Eastern expansion was not an end in itself. It brought the Northmen not only wealth but also new ideas, technologies, and religious influences. Contacts with Byzantium and the Slavic peoples would play a decisive role in the Christianization of Scandinavia in the long term. When the Vikings increasingly turned their attention to the Frankish Empire in the 9th century, two very different worlds collided. On one side stood the Northmen, flexible, mobile, with a maritime striking power that allowed them to use coasts and rivers like open roads. On the other side, the empire of the Carolingians and later the West Frankish kings, territorially large, with a deeply rooted Christian tradition, but in practice often fragmented and dependent on the loyalty of regional nobles. This constellation was made for a series of encounters that would change the face of Europe both militarily and diplomatically. Already in the 8040s, the Vikings had explored the course of the Seine, plundered smaller towns, and seized valuable trade goods. But probably the most notorious episode occurred in 845 when a fleet under the leadership of a chieftain whom the chronicles call Ragnar, possibly Ragnar Lothbrok, entered Paris. The Franks, unable to effectively defend the city, were forced to pay a high tribute, 7,000 pounds of silver, to induce the attackers to withdraw. These damage-old payments became a recurring pattern in the coming decades, which brought peace in the short term, but encouraged further raids in the long term. The Frankish reaction to the threat was ambivalent. On the one hand, they tried to secure the rivers by building and reinforcing bridges and fortifications. These defensive works, such as the fortified bridge of Pont, Deal Archie, could temporarily prevent individual advances, but were only limitedly effective against the Vikings' adaptability. On the other hand, the West Frankish rulers increasingly relied on diplomatic solutions by granting individual Viking leaders land, titles, and rights to win them as allies. Probably the most consequential of these steps occurred in the year 911. The West Frankish King Charles the Simple concluded the Treaty of St. Clair, surrept with the Viking leader Rollo. Rollo, whose origin likely came from Denmark or Norway, received a territory on the Lower Seine, the later Duchy of Normandy, as a fief. In return, he pledged to protect the land against further Viking attacks and to accept Christianity. This agreement was more than just a peace treaty. It created a political entity that became a bridge between the Nordic and the Frankish worlds. The settlement of the Vikings in Normandy proceeded remarkably quickly. Within a few generations, they had largely assimilated, adopted the French language, yet retained their naval fleets and further developed their military capabilities. The name Normandy, land of the Northmen, remained as a reminder of their origin, but their identity transformed from seafaring warriors to firmly established territorial lords. This merging of two cultures produced a military and organizational strength that was impressively demonstrated in 1066 in the Norman conquest of England under William the Conqueror. Compared to other regions where Vikings settled, integration in Normandy was particularly profound. While in Ireland and the Danelaw parts of the Nordic culture were preserved but ultimately absorbed into the local tradition, a new synthesis emerged in Normandy. It combined the strategic foresight and art of war of the Vikings with the feudal structures and courtly culture of the Frankish Empire. The encounter between the Franks and the Northmen was thus an example that lasting political entities could arise from repeated conflicts, skillful diplomacy, and mutual benefit. Enemies became neighbors, attackers became allies, and wandering warriors became territorial princes. But while a new order emerged in Normandy, a profound change took place in Scandinavia itself. The old pagan worldview came under the pressure of a new religion, and the transformation of Nordic society would soon herald the end of the classic Viking Age. As the 10th century entered its last third, the world of the Northmen was in a profound transition. The coasts of Europe had long known their sails, but the times when sudden raids made the heart of Christian kingdoms tremble were coming to an end. Instead, a new order began to emerge, one in which the cross increasingly took the place of Thor's hammer, and in which the fate of the Vikings was no longer decided solely at sea, but also in churches and royal courts. The Christianization of Scandinavia did not occur in a single dramatic moment, but in a process spanning decades that combined trade, diplomacy, mission, and occasionally force. First impulses came through close contacts with Christian realms Normandy, England, the Frankish Empire, and Byzantium. Merchants and mercenaries brought home not only silver and fabrics but also stories, symbols, and beliefs. In the courts of the jarls and kings, these influences began to take root. Particularly influential were the rulers who consciously took the step towards Christianity. Harold Bluetooth, King of Denmark, is immortalized in the Jelling Stones as the one who made the Danes Christians. His decision was likely less a sudden change of faith than a strategic decision. Connection to the Christian world promised political legitimacy, stronger alliances, and trade advantages. Olaf Tryggvason proceeded similarly in Norway, accepting baptism after stays in England and Ireland, and enforcing it in his realm with missionary zeal, often against the resistance of tradition-conscious chieftains. With the new faith, the political structure of Scandinavia also changed. The introduction of ecclesiastical organizations created a network of bishoprics and parishes that took over not only religious but also administrative functions. Written records gained importance, and the legal system was more strongly codified. The Thing assemblies, once places of pagan sacrifice and legal decisions alike, transformed into purely political institutions. This change went hand in hand with a decline in traditional Viking voyages. Several factors played a role here. The coasts of Europe were now better fortified, and many rulers had learned from painful experience how to defend themselves against raids. At the same time, new fields of activity opened up for the Northmen as mercenaries in foreign armies, as merchants on secure routes, or as landowners in the territories they had conquered and settled. A symbolic date for the end of the Viking Age is the year 1066. In this year, the Norwegian King Harald Hardrada failed in his attempt to conquer the English throne at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Only a few days later, William the Conqueror, himself a descendant of Vikings, invaded England and sealed the change of power. Stamford Bridge was not the last fight of a Northman, but certainly the last great enterprise that stood in the spirit of the old Viking expansion. Compared to the wild, unpredictable beginnings, the end of the Viking Age seemed almost quiet. It was not an abrupt disappearance, but a process of integration. The Northmen merged with the peoples among whom they had settled. Their descendants spoke other languages, wore other clothes, and worshipped other gods. But in their customs, in place names, and in parts of the legal system, the legacy of the Vikings lived on. This transition also marked the beginning of a new Nordic identity. The seafarers and warriors became farmers, merchants, craftsmen, and nobles in a networked Christian world. The boldness and adaptability that had once characterized their voyages remained. Only the goals had changed, and so the circle closes. Out of a pagan, largely isolated world, the Vikings had conquered a space that reached from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, from the Atlantic to the Black Sea. In the end, they themselves had become part of this networked world. Even though the time of great voyages and raids has long passed, the legacy of the Vikings lives on in surprisingly diverse ways, not only in museums or in the pages of old chronicles, but in everyday life, in languages, in cultural traditions, and in the collective memory of entire nations. Whoever walks through the streets of York, Dublin, or Rouen today moves on ground that was once trodden, built upon, and shaped by Northmen. A particularly visible part of this legacy is language. In English, numerous words stem from Old Norse, relics of a time when the Danelaw and Norman rule created close contacts between the cultures. Terms like sky, window, law, or husband go directly back to Nordic roots. Even in the names of the days of the week, the old pantheon lives on. Tuesday refers to the war god Tar, Wednesday to Odin, Thursday to Thor, and Friday to Freya. In Scandinavia itself, place names, dialects, and loanwords remind us of the time when the language of the Vikings resonated far beyond their homeland. But the legacy is far more than linguistic. In culture, the Vikings have left a lasting impression. Archaeological finds, artfully decorated jewelry, richly forged swords, and filigree wood carvings testify to an aesthetic world in which functionality and beauty went hand in hand. The patterns and symbols, from Thor's hammer to intertwined animal motifs, are found today not only in historical reconstructions but inspire art, design, and fashion. The storytelling tradition of the Northmen has also left traces. The Icelandic sagas, written down in the 13th century, are more than just literary works. They are a window into the mindset, values, and conflicts of a society that highly valued courage, honor, loyalty, but also cunning and adaptability. These stories, whether of Leif Erikson, Ragnar Lothbrok, or the gods of Asgard, continue to influence literature, film, and pop culture today. Series, novels, and computer games take up the motifs, reinterpret them, and contribute to the name Viking being a household term worldwide. In the modern identity of Scandinavia, the Viking heritage plays an ambivalent role. On the one hand, it serves as a proud symbol of the spirit of discovery, independence, and assertiveness. On the other hand, historical research strives to differentiate the image of the Vikings, away from the cliché of unbridled raiders towards a multifaceted people of farmers, traders, diplomats, and craftsmen. In countries like Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and Iceland, festivals, reenactments, and museums are used to keep this history alive, not only as a tourist attraction but also as part of their own self-understanding. If one compares the legacy of the Vikings with that of other great cultures, it is noticeable how much it is characterized by adaptability. While the Roman Empire left its traces primarily in monumental architecture and legal systems, the legacy of the Northmen lives on more strongly in the structures of everyday life, in language, place names, trade routes, and cultural customs. These quiet traces are often more resilient because they are embedded in the social fabric and have developed organically over the centuries. In a globalized world, the Viking heritage has also gained a new dimension. It has become part of an international culture that crosses borders. Historical ships are rebuilt and sailed across the oceans to demonstrate the nautical skills of the Northmen. Archaeological research in Scandinavia, England, Russia, and North America regularly brings new findings that further sharpen the picture of the Vikings and simultaneously strengthen their relevance in public consciousness. Thus, the history of the Vikings does not end on the banks of the rivers or the beaches where they once landed. It continues in our language and our stories, in the way we think about discovery, trade, war, and coexistence. The legacy of the Vikings is alive because it can change without losing its core. And exactly therein lies its timeless power. It reminds us that true greatness consists not only in conquering, but also in the weaving together of cultures. A thought that accompanies us at the conclusion of this journey. When we now look back on this journey, from the misty morning hours before Lindisfarne, when the first dragon boats emerged from the haze, through the great voyages to the west, to the distant shores of inland, the trade routes along the rivers of Eastern Europe, the encounters with Franks and Byzantines, the profound change through Christianization, and finally the lasting legacy in language, culture, and identity, then we realize that the history of the Vikings is far more than a sequence of battles and discoveries. It is the history of a culture that learned to cross boundaries, geographic, cultural, and spiritual, a culture that distinguished itself not only by courage and fighting spirit, but also by its ability to accept the new, to change, and yet to preserve its roots. The Northmen did not disappear. They became part of that world which they had once so deeply shaped. Perhaps exactly therein lies the message we can draw from their history today, that change does not mean loss, but a chance to grow and leave traces that outlast generations. Each of us carries a piece of this spirit of discovery within us, the ability to step onto new land, to build bridges between worlds, and to face the challenges of life with an open gaze. If this journey has inspired you, I invite you to go further on a tour of discovery with me. Let us explore new epochs, cultures, and stories in the next video that expand our understanding of the world. Subscribe to the channel, share your thoughts and questions in the comments, and let us keep history alive together, for today, for tomorrow, and for the coming generations. For history does not end. It lives on in us as long as we are ready to tell it.